Welcome back. In her first television interview since taking the bench, Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett pushed back on the idea the court isn't doing enough to check the powers of President Trump.
The Supreme Court, and I can speak for myself in the way that I make these decisions. It's not our job to survey and decide whether, the current occupant of an office in this particular moment is, to form a political view. That's the job of journalists, that's the job of other politicians, or that's the job of the people. But our job is to decide these legal questions.
We've got the right people to talk about this and more. Leslie Sanchez and Chuck Rocha join us now from our D.C. bureau. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist, and Chuck is a Democratic strategist. Good morning to you both and welcome. Leslie, let's start with what we just heard there. The Supreme Court has a conservative majority. It has handed President Trump several wins when it comes to immunity and other topics. Doesn't the perception that the court has moved to the right contradict what we just heard from Justice Barrett?
I think that one thing that's true about this is there's been so much kind of vacillating back and forth between what people thought her opinions would be like and her votes would be like, right, and her decisions, but it ultimately didn't come true. She was called a religious zealot, and then she was called by liberals the last best hope. I think what's consistent about her is her love for the law. And Justice Barrett has talked about she's going to be unpopular in those decisions. She's been underestimated. People were not really clear what she would do and thought she'd be dogmatic in her approach. The Washington Post called her a handmaiden, handman. It was really just such an unfairness to what she ultimately did, and that is be a very reasonable voice on the court.
And Chuck, last week, President Trump asked the Supreme Court to take up his tariff fight after a judge ruled that many of them were illegal. And new CBS News polling shows a majority of Americans oppose tariffs. So is there a risk that the president is out of step with the American people regardless of what the court decides?
It's very much a risk because the American people will see these tariffs as a tax because they're starting to already feel the cost of that. And what you've seen Justice Barrett doing is trying to clean up some of the image of the court. The courts are appointed to be nonpartisan by politicians. So as much as they don't want to make it political, it's a political appointment. And Donald Trump has really had his hand on this Supreme Court, appointing a lot of folks. And I tell Democrats all the time, and Democrats are running campaigns saying we have to win the presidency so that we can appoint some of our justices. And this thing around ours is the key here, because each justice, whether they like it or not, are going to have tendencies the way they interpret the law to be along the ideological thinking of themselves. When they're supposed to be nonpartisan, they try to be, but never are they.
And we just saw some polling there showing the impact of the tariffs on people's wallets. And that polling also shows, Leslie, that President Trump's overall job rating has actually ticked up since July. And that's despite a weak jobs report that's also in the mix. From your view, why is that? And does the president have a ceiling when it comes to his approval rating, since his supporters love him, but independents and Democrats don't seem to?
Abilities, right? Going through back to the first term, he was somebody who never really broke that 40% kind of higher than that approval rating. He finally did tick up past that when he started talking about crime, getting hold of, immigration, national security, and some of the big reforms that he's moving forward now and taking the economy front and center. I think the president's going to see a little bit of that vacillating, but his strength on the economy, on crime, on the border security are really going to help propel those economic numbers. And going into midterms next year, those are the fundamentals. Yes, job approval, but how people feel in the economy, in their personal households, is going to deliver what happens in the midterms.
And Chuck, on that point, Democrats may not like it, but is President Trump's tough on crime approach working for him? I mean, an increase in support is clear.
He's going to continue to talk about crime. He's going to continue to talk about the border, and he's going to continue to talk about immigration. And he's going to live in that space because that's where he's the most popular, and the American public sees him as doing something. The problem is that doesn't stop everybody from going to the grocery store every day and seeing the rise in prices. It doesn't help when you see folks who are looking for jobs. Which one of these two alternative conversations really take hold by the midterms is where we're going to see the outcome of the next election. Will it be a crime and borders election, or will it be an economy economy and a rising prices conversation. That's where you're going to see it juxtaposed of these two coming directly together.
All right, we'll keep watching this all closely and stay close to both of you, Leslie Sanchez and Chuck Rocha. Thanks so much.